The sun was shining brightly over the grand palace, making the golden rooftops glitter like they had been sprinkled with tiny stars. People from all over the world had gathered to see it, and the excitement in the air was almost electric. Among them was a young tourist named Daniel, who was always looking for a little adventure, a little mischief, and a story he could tell his friends back home. He had traveled far to see this place, but he was more curious about the people guarding it than the palace itself. Daniel had heard stories about the royal guards. They were famous not just for their stiff uniforms and tall hats, but for their perfect discipline. They stood motionless for hours, never blinking, never smiling, never reacting no matter what happened around them. Tourists would wave their hands, shout silly jokes, even jump in front of them. But the guards remained statuesque, almost as if they were made of stone. Daniel found that fascinating. He watched from behind the rope that separated the tourists from the guards. His eyes were drawn to a particular guard, a man with a thick, perfectly groomed mustache that curled slightly at the ends. It looked almost magical to Daniel. He wondered how someone could maintain such a perfect mustache while standing still all day in the sun, in all kinds of weather. It was like a symbol of his discipline, a sign that he had trained his mind and body to be unshakable. Daniel's friends were nearby, busy taking selfies and admiring the palace. They were excited, laughing and chatting, but Daniel's mind was racing with a daring thought. What if I did something no one else dared to do? He thought. He looked around to see if anyone was watching him closely. Most tourists were busy taking pictures or looking at the palace, completely unaware of his plan. Daniel smiled to himself. The idea was mischievous, a little crazy, but Daniel could not resist. He imagined what would happen if he reached out and tugged the guard's mustache. Just a tiny pull, nothing serious. It sounded funny in his mind. He imagined the guard's reaction. Maybe a slight twitch, a tiny flinch. That would make a great story to tell his friends. "I touched the royal guard's mustache," he would say. People would laugh, and he would become the hero of the day. As he stepped closer, he noticed the guard's expression. The man's face was serious, perfectly calm, but there was something intense in his eyes. It was as if he could see right through Daniel. The guard did not move, did not react, but Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine. His heart began to beat faster. He thought, it's just a mustache. He won't mind. It's harmless fun. Daniel inched closer, trying to look casual. He adjusted his backpack and smiled at the other tourists, pretending to be just another visitor. But inside, his excitement was growing. Every step felt like a secret mission. He imagined himself as a hero in a movie, sneaking past invisible alarms, daring to do what no one else had dared. He noticed other tourists pointing their phones at the guards. Some were filming, some were snapping photos. Daniel realized this could make the perfect video. He could record the reaction, maybe even post it online later. This will be amazing, he thought, unable to resist the temptation. As he reached out his hand slowly, his friends were still a few steps behind, busy taking pictures of the palace. Daniel's fingers were trembling slightly, but he tried to steady them. He thought about what might happen if the guard noticed him before he touched the mustache. Panic and excitement mixed together in his chest, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He stretched his hand forward, his fingers almost touching the thick, carefully combed hairs of the mustache. Time seemed to slow down. Every second felt stretched, every breath heavier. Daniel imagined the guard finally reacting, maybe shaking his head, maybe smiling just a little, just to surprise everyone. He imagined the applause and laughter of the tourists around him, but then he hesitated. He felt a strange sense of respect mixed with fear. This was not just any man. This was a royal guard, trained for years to hold himself perfectly still, to follow rules without question. Daniel realized that maybe this was serious. He thought of the stories he had heard, how guards had been serving for decades, how they were taught discipline, patience, and honor. He felt a moment of doubt. Maybe I shouldn't, he whispered to himself, but his curiosity and excitement were stronger. He had come so far, and this would be the adventure of a lifetime. He told himself it was harmless, just a little prank. Just a little tug, no one would get hurt, and he would be the hero of the day. As Daniel's fingers finally brushed against the mustache, he felt the guard's eyes lock onto him. The man didn't move a muscle, but the intensity of his stare was enough to make Daniel freeze. It was as if time itself had stopped. Daniel's heart pounded loudly in his chest. The laughter and chatter of the tourists around him faded into silence. All he could hear was his own breathing, fast and uneven. Daniel laughed nervously, trying to hide his fear. "It's okay," he said under his breath. "It's just a joke. It's harmless." But deep inside, he felt a strange twinge of worry. This was no ordinary man, no ordinary moment. The guard's presence was commanding, almost magical, like a force that could not be ignored. The other tourists began to notice Daniel's strange behavior. Some stopped taking pictures. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the young man inching closer to the guard. Daniel realized that eyes were on him, but he pushed the thought away. He focused only on the mustache, the perfect, carefully maintained symbol of the guard's discipline. He finally made the move. With a quick, almost invisible tug, his fingers brushed the mustache. But instead of the laughter he expected, there was silence. The guard did not flinch. He did not react. His eyes were still locked on Daniel, calm but unyielding. Daniel felt a cold shock run through his body. Something was very wrong. He tried to pull back quickly, but the guard's presence was overwhelming. Daniel felt trapped, caught in a moment he could not escape. He looked around, hoping someone would laugh or distract the guard, but no one did. Everyone seemed frozen, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Daniel suddenly realized that this was not a joke. He had underestimated the guard, the palace, and the importance of respect. The thrill he had felt moments ago turned into a sinking feeling in his stomach. He felt embarrassed, foolish, and very, very small. As he stepped back, trying to smile nervously, he noticed the guard take a single step forward. It was slow, deliberate, and calm. Daniel froze again, his mind racing. This was the moment when he realized he had crossed a line. He had dared to touch something sacred, something that represented centuries of tradition and discipline, and now he was about to learn that actions had consequences, even in the most unexpected places. Daniel's adventure had begun with excitement and mischief, but now it was turning into a lesson he would never forget. He looked at the guard, whose face remained calm, almost kind, but whose eyes told a story of authority, respect, and history. Daniel's heart pounded, not with fear alone, but with a sudden understanding of how serious this moment truly was. He wished he could rewind time, take a step back and laugh it off, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. This was real. And for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility, the power of respect, and the value of discipline. His adventure was far from over, and he had no idea what the guard would do next. But one thing was certain. Daniel would never forget this moment. The shining palace, the perfect mustache, and the calm, unyielding stare of the royal guard who had silently reminded him that some things are not meant to be toyed with. Daniel froze in place as the guard's eyes bore into him. The calmness on the guard's face was almost frightening. Daniel had expected some kind of reaction, maybe a twitch, maybe a laugh, but nothing happened. Instead, there was a silence so thick it seemed to press down on everyone around him. Tourists stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped laughing. Some were filming with their phones. Others whispered quietly, but all eyes had turned toward Daniel and the guard. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like a small bird caught in a storm. His hand, which had just touched the mustache, trembled slightly. He tried to pull it back slowly, hoping the moment would pass, hoping the guard would ignore him, but the guard simply took a single step forward. It was deliberate, steady, and slow, yet every step carried a weight of authority that made Daniel's stomach tighten. For a brief second, Daniel thought about running. He could bolt back to his friends, disappear into the crowd, and act like nothing had happened. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he realized the guard's eyes followed him like a shadow. There was no escaping this. The guard's presence was magnetic, and Daniel felt himself rooted to the spot, powerless to move. The other tourists around him were watching closely. Some were gasping softly, others were whispering. Daniel could hear bits of conversation like, "Did he just..." and "I can't believe he touched the guard." He felt a blush rise to his cheeks. For the first time, he realized how foolish his idea had been. What had seemed like harmless fun was now a serious situation, and everyone was watching him make a mistake. The guard stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. Daniel noticed the man's uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp and every button polished. The hat on his head sat perfectly straight, and the boots gleamed in the sunlight. But it wasn't just the uniform that commanded respect. It was the guard himself. He radiated discipline, pride, and control, qualities Daniel had only admired from afar. Now Daniel understood that these qualities were not just for show. They were real and they demanded respect. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, trying to make a joke, to laugh it off. It was just a prank. But no words came out. His throat felt dry and his mind raced for something clever to say, something that could save him from embarrassment. But nothing worked. The guard did not smile, did not laugh, did not react in the way Daniel had imagined. There was no escape in humor, no relief in charm. This was real, and the guard was not someone who would be fooled. Then the guard lifted a hand slowly, pointing toward a small area near the palace entrance. Daniel didn't understand at first, but a palace official stepped forward, gesturing for him to follow. Daniel's heart sank. This was not just a glance or a warning. This was an escort, and it felt serious. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Some tourists whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Others shook their phones in surprise, still recording. Daniel felt the weight of every eye on him as he took slow steps toward the official. As he walked, Daniel's mind raced with regret. He thought about what he had done, how reckless he had been, how silly it was to think this would be fun. The guard had not even spoken, but Daniel felt like he had been lectured already. There was a dignity in the man's presence that made Daniel feel small, almost childlike. He realized that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, no matter how tempting it seemed. The official led him to a quiet area just off the main courtyard. There were no tourists here, no cameras, only the stillness of the palace walls and the quiet hum of palace life. Daniel felt isolated, trapped in a moment of embarrassment and fear. The guard followed silently, his gaze still fixed on Daniel. There was no anger, no shouting, only an intense calm that made Daniel feel exposed and vulnerable. Finally, the guard spoke. His voice was low, steady, and calm, but it carried a weight that made Daniel straighten up immediately. "Do you understand why your actions were wrong?" the guard asked. It was not a question in the usual sense, it was a statement that demanded reflection. Daniel nodded quickly, swallowing hard. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words felt inadequate. I just wanted to," he began, but the guard held up a hand. "Silence," the guard said firmly. "This is not a matter of intent. It is a matter of respect." Daniel felt the word sink in. Respect. That simple word carried centuries of tradition, discipline, and pride. It was more than just manners. It was a principle that guided the lives of those who served this palace, those who stood as guardians of history and honor. Daniel had ignored it, and now he was learning the consequences. The guard motioned for Daniel to sit on a bench nearby. As Daniel lowered himself, he felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. The guard continued, speaking slowly, clearly, and without anger. He explained the role of the royal guards, the training they underwent, and the values they held dear. Daniel listened, fascinated despite his embarrassment. He realized that what he had thought was a simple joke was actually a violation of something much deeper, something sacred to those who served. The guard talked about discipline, about how standing still for hours was not just physical but mental, about how pride and respect were earned, not given. Daniel began to feel a sense of awe. This was not just a man standing in a uniform. This was a person who had dedicated himself to a role that demanded absolute focus, courage, and respect. And Daniel had, in a moment of thoughtlessness, disrespected that dedication. As the explanation continued, Daniel felt a mix of shame and admiration. He thought about how easy it had been to underestimate the guard, to think of him as just a statue, a prop for tourists. But now he understood that the guard's stillness was not a costume. It was a testament to years of training and commitment. Daniel felt a deep respect growing in his heart, replacing the mischievous excitement he had felt just moments ago. The guard then asked Daniel to reflect on his actions. He wanted Daniel to understand the importance of thinking before acting, the importance of respecting others, and the value of discipline. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the prank he had pulled, the faces of the tourists around him, and the calm, powerful presence of the guard. He realized how foolish he had been, how lucky he was that the guard had been patient and calm rather than angry. Daniel began to speak, his voice small but sincere. I didn't realize. I thought it would be funny. I didn't mean any harm." The guard listened, nodding slightly. There was no harsh judgment, only the expectation that Daniel learn from this moment. Daniel felt a sense of relief, knowing that he could be honest, but he also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The guard continued to teach him, explaining that respect was not just for guards or palaces, but for people, traditions, and history everywhere. He spoke about honor, patience, and the idea that every action, no matter how small, had consequences. Daniel listened intently, absorbing every word. It was like a lesson in life itself, wrapped in the quiet dignity of the palace walls. After what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the guard finally allowed Daniel to rise. He stood feeling slightly taller but also humbled. He looked at the guard, noticing every detail, the crisp uniform, the polished boots, the perfectly groomed mustache, and felt a newfound respect. What had begun as a joke had transformed into a moment of learning, a lesson he would carry forever. As Daniel walked back toward the main courtyard, he felt the eyes of other tourists on him again. This time he did not feel embarrassed. Instead, he felt reflective. He realized that his story would not be one of mischief but of understanding and growth. He had learned something that could never be taught through books or videos, something that came only from experience, from facing the quiet authority of someone who commanded respect simply by being. And as he glanced back at the guard who had returned to his post, standing perfectly still and unwavering, Daniel felt a sense of awe. The lesson was clear. Some moments, some people, and some traditions were not to be taken lightly. What he had thought would be a small joke had turned into a life lesson, and he would never forget it. Daniel had thought the worst was over. He had learned his lesson, had reflected on his impulsive behavior, and had felt the weight of respect and tradition pressing on him. He believed he could now blend back into the crowd, laugh it off, and perhaps even pretend it had never happened. But the guard had something else in mind, a deeper lesson, one Daniel had not anticipated. The guard motioned for him to follow once again, this time toward a quieter area of the palace courtyard. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had thought this would be a short talk, a gentle warning. But as he walked, guided by the steady, silent figure of the guard, he realized that this was more serious. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the crowds of tourists faded behind him, replaced by the hushed grandeur of the palace walls. Daniel noticed small details he had never paid attention to before. The stone pathway under his feet was smooth and polished, worn down slightly by centuries of footsteps. The palace walls were decorated with intricate carvings, each telling a story of history and service. The sunlight glinted off the gold trim of the gates, casting tiny sparkles that seemed almost magical. But Daniel barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind was focused entirely on the lesson he was about to receive, and on the guard's calm, commanding presence. Finally, they arrived at a small area off to the side, partially hidden from the main courtyard. It was quiet, almost peaceful, but there was an energy to it, a sense that this space was used for teaching, reflection, and discipline. Daniel felt a shiver of nervous anticipation. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it would not be simple or easy. The guard turned to him, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You need to understand," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that respect is earned and understanding comes from experience, not assumption. You must learn that some things are not meant for jest." Daniel nodded quickly, swallowing hard. He wanted to speak, to explain himself again, but he knew words were not enough. This was a moment to observe, to listen, and to learn. The guard gestured for Daniel to stand at attention. Confused, Daniel followed, trying to mimic the rigid stance of the guards he had watched earlier. He stiffened his arms, straightened his back, and lifted his chin, though his knees wobbled slightly. The guard circled him slowly, observing. Every movement Daniel made felt exaggerated, awkward, and clumsy in comparison to the perfect posture of the professional guards. "Discipline," the guard said, pointing to Daniel's stance, "is not just about standing still. It is about control, focus, and respect for your surroundings. You will learn by doing, not just by being told." Daniel's heart raced. He had never imagined that touching a mustache could lead to this. Standing in silence, trying to hold himself perfectly while someone watched every detail of his posture. The guard began to demonstrate. He moved slowly, deliberately, showing the proper way to stand, the correct placement of feet, the angle of the chin, and the evenness of the shoulders. Daniel watched closely, trying to imitate every tiny detail. It was harder than it looked. Every slight shift of weight, every small adjustment felt amplified under the watchful eyes of the guard. Daniel could feel the heat of embarrassment on his face. He knew every tourist nearby would laugh if they could see him now, struggling to stand like a statue. As he continued, the guard spoke again, explaining the philosophy behind the discipline. Standing still is a test of patience. It trains the mind to resist distraction. It teaches you to remain calm even when chaos surrounds you. It is not just physical. It is mental, emotional, and moral. Daniel felt a new respect growing inside him. He began to understand that this was not about being stiff or boring. It was about control, self-discipline, and honor. Time passed slowly, but Daniel's focus never wavered. The guard's presence was constant, a reminder of the standards Daniel had momentarily ignored. Every second of stillness felt like a small victory. Daniel could feel his mind adjusting, learning the importance of concentration and patience. It was a strange, humbling experience, standing silently, aware of every detail of his body, every heartbeat, every breath. After a while, the guard asked Daniel to move. He demonstrated a simple ceremonial walk, slow, precise steps, each one deliberate and controlled. Daniel tried to follow, his movements stiff and awkward at first. But with gentle guidance from the guard, he began to improve. Step by step, he learned the rhythm, the focus, the importance of even the smallest details. He realized that every movement, no matter how small, carried meaning when performed with discipline. During this time, the guard continued to explain the significance of their role. He spoke of history, of generations of guards who had served the palace with pride and dedication. He talked about how tourists sometimes underestimated their duty, thinking it was merely ceremonial. Daniel listened with rapt attention, absorbing not only the physical lessons but the values behind them. Every word reinforced the lesson he had already begun to understand. Respect was not optional, it was essential. Daniel felt a mix of emotions. There was embarrassment, certainly, for having acted impulsively, but there was also admiration for the guard, for the discipline required, and for the centuries of tradition that were maintained with such care. He realized that what had seemed like a silly, harmless prank was actually a serious breach of respect. And now he was learning the lesson fully, through action and reflection rather than words alone. After what felt like hours, though it had only been a short while, the guard finally allowed Daniel to relax. He stepped back and nodded, a quiet approval in his eyes. Daniel felt a wave of relief, but also pride. He had struggled, learned, and improved. He had taken part in a process that taught patience, respect, and focus. The lesson was not over, but he could feel that he had begun to understand. The guard spoke one last time, calmly but with emphasis. Remember this moment. It is not the touching of a mustache that matters, but the understanding of why some actions are unacceptable. Discipline and respect are earned through experience, through learning, and through reflection. Daniel nodded, his mind racing to absorb every word. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the patience and guidance of the guard, who had taught him without anger or harshness. As Daniel walked back toward the main courtyard, he felt changed. He noticed the crowds, the tourists taking photos, the chatter and laughter, but he no longer felt embarrassed or mischievous. He felt thoughtful, reflective, and humbled. The palace, once just a beautiful building, now felt alive with history, tradition, and meaning. And the guard, who had seemed so distant and untouchable, now felt like a teacher, imparting a lesson Daniel would carry for life. For the first time, Daniel truly understood the value of discipline, patience, and respect. He realized that every action, no matter how small or seemingly harmless, had consequences. And he understood that learning often came in unexpected ways, sometimes through mistakes, sometimes through embarrassment, and sometimes through the calm authority of someone who demanded nothing but reflection and understanding. Daniel glanced back at the guard one last time. The man stood perfectly still, mustache immaculate, posture flawless. But to Daniel, he was no longer just a guard. He was a symbol of the values that had been passed down for generations. A reminder that some lessons were worth learning the hard way, and some respect was earned only through experience. As Daniel left the quiet area and returned to the bustling courtyard, he felt a mix of relief, pride, and newfound respect. He had come seeking adventure, mischief, and perhaps a funny story to tell his friends. But he had received something far greater, a lesson in patience, discipline, and the importance of respect that he would never forget. He walked slowly, reflecting on the day's events, replaying the moments in his mind. Every step reminded him of the guard's presence, the careful lessons, and the silent, unyielding discipline that had guided his learning. He knew he would carry this story with him, not as a tale of mischief, but as a memory of growth, understanding, and a lesson that had changed him in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. Daniel returned to the main courtyard, his steps slow and thoughtful. The chatter of the tourists, the clicking of cameras, and the laughter of children felt different now. Everything seemed louder, almost exaggerated, yet Daniel felt strangely disconnected from it all. He realized he had experienced something that the others around him could never understand. What had begun as a simple prank had become a deep personal lesson, a lesson about respect, discipline, and humility. But Daniel's adventure was far from over. The guard, standing silently at his post, motioned for him to come closer once more. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had thought he had learned his lesson, had reflected and absorbed the values of discipline and respect. But the guard's hand gesture suggested that there was more to experience. Daniel followed cautiously, feeling the weight of every step. The guard led him to a small ceremonial area, set apart from the tourists. It was a quiet space with polished stones, neatly trimmed bushes, and an air of solemnity. Daniel noticed the sun glinting off the golden trim of the walls, creating tiny sparkles like fireflies. But he barely noticed the beauty. His mind was focused entirely on what he was about to face. He wondered what more the guard could teach him and what embarrassment still awaited him. "Stand here," the guard said calmly, pointing to a spot in the center of the area. Daniel obeyed, placing his feet carefully, trying to mimic the rigid posture of the guards. He felt exposed, almost as if everyone in the courtyard could see him even though they were far away. He knew that every mistake he made in his stance or movement would be noticed, not just by the guard, but in his imagination, by the invisible eyes of everyone around him. The guard began to explain the history of their role in greater detail. He spoke about the centuries of tradition, the pride in protecting the palace, and the responsibility of serving with honor. Daniel listened intently. He felt a strange mix of awe and embarrassment. He had brushed off the significance of the guard's role earlier, seeing them as mere decorations for tourists. But now he understood that their discipline, patience, and composure were the result of years of training and unwavering dedication. As the guard spoke, he demonstrated several ceremonial movements. Daniel watched closely, then attempted to imitate them. Each motion required focus, control, and precision. At first, his movements were stiff and awkward. He nearly stumbled over a small step. His arms did not align properly, and his head tilted slightly. The guard corrected him silently, showing the proper placement with slow, deliberate gestures. Daniel followed, trying to absorb every detail. The exercise was humbling. Every mistake made him feel the weight of his earlier impulsiveness. He realized that he had not only disrespected the guard, but also the centuries of tradition he represented. Each movement, each adjustment was a reminder that even small actions could carry meaning and consequence. Daniel felt his cheeks grow warm with shame, but he also felt a growing sense of respect and determination to learn. The guard then guided Daniel through a short ceremonial march. Each step had to be precise, each turn deliberate. Daniel felt his heart race with the effort of concentration. The movements were simple in appearance, but every step required mental and physical discipline. As he progressed, he began to feel a connection to the centuries-old traditions, a sense of responsibility that he had never imagined. The embarrassment he had felt earlier now mixed with pride in learning something meaningful. While Daniel practiced, the guard spoke again about respect, not just for the palace or the uniform, but for all people, all traditions, and all rules. Respect, the guard said calmly, is not optional. It is earned through understanding, reflection, and care. It is demonstrated not through words, but through actions. Daniel felt the truth of this statement settle deep inside him. He realized that his impulsive act of pulling the mustache had been a moment of thoughtlessness, and now he was experiencing the consequences of that thoughtlessness in the most memorable way. After several minutes, the guard allowed Daniel to stop and rest. He motioned for him to sit on a small stone bench nearby. Daniel's legs felt stiff, and his mind was racing with all he had learned. He reflected on his actions. The mischief, the curiosity, the desire to impress his friends. He realized how quickly fun could turn into embarrassment, how easily a moment of thoughtlessness could teach a lifelong lesson. The guard spoke once more, in a calm but firm tone. Your actions have consequences. You have learned a lesson today, but understanding it fully requires reflection. Remember the discipline you practiced, the focus you held, and the respect you showed by listening and learning. This knowledge will guide you in the future. Daniel nodded, feeling the depth of the lesson. He had come expecting a laugh, a prank, perhaps even a story to share. Instead, he had received something far more valuable, a sense of responsibility and understanding that would stay with him forever. Daniel noticed the tourists in the main courtyard, many of whom were still observing the guards from a distance. He felt a mix of relief and humility. He had once thought of them as simply people in uniforms standing like statues. Now he understood the significance of their role, the dedication behind every step, every posture, every motion. He realized that respect was not something to be taken lightly, and that even the smallest acts could carry meaning. The guard allowed Daniel to leave the ceremonial area and return to the main courtyard. As he walked, Daniel felt a mixture of emotions, pride in having learned something meaningful, embarrassment at his earlier impulsiveness, and gratitude for the patience and guidance of the guard. He understood that he had been given a rare opportunity to experience the discipline, pride, and patience that defined the royal guards, not just as observers, but as a participant. As he returned to the crowd, Daniel noticed people glancing at him. Some seemed curious, others amused, but Daniel did not feel ashamed in the same way he had before. Instead, he felt reflective. He had learned something more valuable than a funny story or a prank. He had learned the importance of patience, focus, and respect. The embarrassment he had felt earlier was replaced by a quiet pride in having faced the lesson. Having learned it and having grown from it, Daniel walked slowly, taking in the grandeur of the palace, the sparkling rooftops, and the disciplined guards. Everything felt more meaningful now. He realized that humor and curiosity were fine, but they needed to be balanced with awareness, respect, and understanding. He thought about the centuries of tradition he had witnessed and understood that some things were sacred, deserving care, attention, and respect. Finally, Daniel looked back at the guard who had guided him through this experience. The man stood perfectly still as he had all day, his posture immaculate, his mustache perfectly groomed. But to Daniel, the guard was no longer just a figure of discipline. He was a teacher, a guide, a symbol of the values Daniel had begun to understand. Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew he would never forget this moment, nor the lessons it had taught him. As Daniel left the courtyard, blending back into the flow of tourists, he felt a sense of calm and reflection. He had come seeking adventure and mischief, but he was leaving with understanding, respect, and humility. The lesson had been humbling, sometimes uncomfortable, and even embarrassing, but it had been unforgettable. And Daniel knew that the memory of the guard, the lesson, and the palace would stay with him for the rest of his life. He walked slowly toward the exit, replaying every step, every movement, every word of the guard's quiet teaching. Daniel understood that some lessons were best learned through experience, through humility, and through the willingness to listen and reflect. He had discovered that respect was not just an idea, it was a practice, a discipline, and a way of being. And for the first time, Daniel felt that he truly understood what it meant. Daniel stepped back into the main courtyard, feeling the warm sunlight on his face and the gentle breeze brushing against him. The palace seemed different now, more alive, more meaningful, more commanding. Every detail he had once seen as decoration or background now held significance. The golden rooftops, the polished stone paths, the perfectly trimmed gardens, and most importantly, the guards standing tall and disciplined. He realized that all of this represented centuries of dedication, honor, and tradition, and for the first time, he truly understood why the royal guards deserved such respect. As he moved through the crowd, Daniel noticed people glancing at him. Some smiled knowingly, as if sensing that he had learned something important. Others looked amused, probably unaware of the experience he had just gone through. Daniel felt a mixture of relief, pride, and humility. The embarrassment of his earlier mischief had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and understanding. He had learned something far more valuable than a funny story or a prank. It was a lesson he would carry for life. Daniel's mind wandered back to the moment when he had touched the guard's mustache. It had seemed like a harmless prank at the time, a tiny act of mischief that would amuse his friends. But now thinking about it, he realized how foolish he had been. He had underestimated the guard, the tradition, and the weight of respect that the palace demanded. That single moment had led to a series of experiences that taught him patience, discipline, humility, and respect, all lessons far more important than he could have imagined. He glanced at the guards again, noticing the calm authority in their posture, the pride in their every movement, and the dedication in their expressions. It was no longer about the mustache or the prank. It was about understanding the people who served, the values they upheld, and the traditions they represented. Daniel felt a deep sense of admiration. These guards were not just statues for tourists to gawk at. They were living symbols of honor, discipline, and commitment. As he walked, Daniel reflected on the lesson he had learned through action. Standing still, following the guard's instructions, and practicing ceremonial movements had been challenging, even uncomfortable. His legs had felt stiff, his arms awkward, and his mind stretched to focus on every detail. But through the struggle he had grown. He had experienced firsthand what it meant to exercise patience, to respect discipline, and to act with awareness. The embarrassment he had once feared had become a tool for learning, shaping him into someone more thoughtful and considerate. Daniel remembered the guard's words. Respect is earned through understanding, reflection, and care. It is demonstrated not through words but through actions. Those words resonated deeply. He understood now that respect was not a suggestion or a guideline. It was a principle that guided the actions of those who served faithfully. Every misstep, every small act of thoughtlessness had consequences. And now, having experienced that consequence, Daniel had gained insight that would stay with him forever. As he continued toward the palace exit, Daniel felt a quiet gratitude. He was grateful for the patience of the guard, for the opportunity to learn, and for the experience that had transformed what could have been a moment of embarrassment into a moment of growth. He realized that not every lesson came from books or lectures. Some lessons came from life itself, through experience, reflection, and the guidance of those who carried knowledge and discipline. Daniel's friends were waiting near the palace gates, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. They were unaware of the depth of the lesson he had learned, and for a moment Daniel felt a little amused. He could have told them the story as a prank, a funny incident involving a royal guard and a mustache. But he knew that the true story, the story of learning, discipline, and respect, was far more meaningful than any joke could convey. He smiled quietly to himself, understanding that some lessons were meant to be felt, not just told. As he walked past the final line of guards, Daniel felt a renewed sense of awareness. Every posture, every step, every glance had purpose. He had learned that the value of tradition and discipline could not be measured by appearances alone. The guards were more than their uniforms, their hats, or their mustaches. They were embodiments of centuries of history, values, and pride. Daniel felt a deep respect for them, a respect that went beyond the moment of his prank and extended into a broader understanding of how human effort and dedication create meaning. Daniel paused for a moment, looking back at the courtyard one last time. He noticed the sunlight glinting on the palace walls, the careful symmetry of the gardens, and the serene, commanding presence of the guards. A wave of reflection washed over him. He realized that his experience had not only taught him about respect for the guards and their role, but also about life in general. Small acts, no matter how trivial they may seem, can have significant consequences. Awareness, patience, and consideration are not just virtues. They are essential for understanding and connecting with the world around us. As he stepped out of the palace grounds, Daniel felt a sense of calm satisfaction. He had entered the palace expecting adventure and perhaps a little mischief, but he was leaving with wisdom and insight. The embarrassment he had once feared had transformed into growth, and the lesson he had learned was one he would never forget. He realized that true understanding often comes through experience, humility, and the willingness to learn from those who have mastered patience and discipline. Daniel knew that when he returned home, he would tell the story, not as a tale of pranks or mischief, but as a story of growth and learning. He would remember the guard, the ceremonial lessons, and the quiet, unyielding discipline that had guided him through a moment of recklessness into a moment of understanding. It was a story not of embarrassment but of transformation, a reminder that lessons often come in unexpected ways, and respect is earned through action, reflection, and awareness. As he walked through the bustling streets outside the palace, Daniel felt lighter yet wiser. Every sound, every movement, every passing person seemed imbued with a new sense of significance. He reflected on how he had once viewed the world lightly, seeking adventure and humor without fully appreciating the depth and meaning behind actions and traditions. Now he understood that life offered lessons in many forms, sometimes through mistakes, sometimes through guidance, and sometimes through moments that seemed small but carried great weight. Daniel looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and smiled. He knew that the memory of the palace, the guards, and the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. He felt gratitude, not only for the opportunity to visit such a magnificent place, but for the chance to grow, to reflect and to learn humility and respect in a way that no book or lecture could ever teach. For the rest of the day, Daniel moved through the city with a sense of calm confidence. He noticed small details he had never seen before, the way people walked, the care they took in their actions, the pride in their expressions. He realized that the lesson of respect, discipline, and reflection was not confined to the palace. It applied to everyday life. Every action, no matter how small, mattered. Every choice had consequences, and every moment was an opportunity to act with thoughtfulness and consideration. As evening approached, Daniel found a quiet bench overlooking a small park. He sat down, thinking back over the day, replaying the moments in his mind. The prank, the embarrassment, the guided lessons, and the reflection all merged into a single coherent experience. He felt a sense of completion, a feeling that he had not only learned a valuable lesson but had also grown as a person. He understood the importance of humility, the power of reflection, and the value of respecting those who serve with dedication and honor. Daniel knew that life would continue to present him with challenges, temptations, and moments of mischief. But he also knew that he had learned something crucial, that awareness, respect, and consideration are far more valuable than laughter gained at the expense of others. He felt a sense of peace knowing that he could carry this lesson with him, applying it in every situation, every interaction, and every decision he would face in the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Daniel rose from the bench. He walked slowly toward his hotel, carrying with him a story of transformation, a lesson of respect, and a memory that would remain vivid in his mind forever. The royal guard's mustache, once a symbol of temptation and mischief, had become a symbol of patience, discipline, and the power of learning from experience. Daniel smiled, knowing that he had been changed in a way that no joke, no prank, and no fleeting adventure could ever achieve. He had come seeking a laugh. He had left with wisdom, and as he walked into the evening, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Some lessons are unforgettable. Some respect is earned only through experience, and some moments, no matter how small, can change a person forever.